Hello, and welcome to the Minnesota Brownfields online resource on environmental assessments for the identification of contamination at brownfield sites. The environmental assessment process is a necessary system through which contamination and environmental risks at brownfield sites can be identified and quantified. Not only is environmental assessment often required to obtain liability assurances and avoid responsibility for cleanup, but it is also a sensible way for potential purchasers of real estate to evaluate risks and capital costs before property transfer. The environmental assessment process for a single property involves an initial assessment of former site history and operations, the Phase I Environmental Site Assessment, ESA. Before purchasing real estate, especially an infill site, it is important to evaluate the level of environmental contamination. An important tool at the disposal of a potential purchaser is the Phase I Environmental Site Assessment, ESA, a widely used, industry-accepted approach used to assess environmentally challenged properties. The Phase I ESA must be prepared by a certified environmental consultant and involves a review of records, site inspection, and interviews with owners, occupants, neighbors, and local government officials in order to produce a report that describes the previous use of a site and what contamination might exist there. Specifically, the report contains documentation of data collected, a summary of the known or suspected recognized environmental conditions, and environmental professionals' opinions on the findings of the Phase I ESA, and a determination of necessary subsequent action. The environmental assessment process was established as a standard procedure in order to satisfy the All-Appropriate Inquiry (AAI) aspect of the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act (CERCLA). To that end, the Phase I ESA not only helps prospective purchasers to be responsible consumers, but it also protects them and contiguous landowners from CERCLA liability. When a recognized environmental condition is discovered during a Phase I ESA, a Phase II ESA is required to confirm suspected chemical or metal contamination. Phase II ESAs are tailored to site-specific demands and rely on direct field-based sampling and analytical techniques to identify and quantify the actual concentration of contaminants in soil and groundwater. This means that the course of action depends on the confirmation of contamination, which may precipitate further testing. Typically, limited sampling and laboratory analysis are first used to confirm or rule out concerns identified in the Phase I ESA. Then, if contamination is found to be significant and/or to exceed federal, state, or local cleanup or human health risk standards, a further site characterization is required in order to help establish the vertical and lateral extent of a contamination plume. Given the findings of the Phase II ESA, the certified environmental consultant preparing the report can then provide recommendations regarding cleanup. It should be noted, however, that the Phase II ESA does not delineate the full extent of contamination, but rather confirms the presence and type of contamination through sampling of a relatively limited number of borings placed in areas most likely, as defined during the Phase I ESA, to be impacted by the potential source. Often larger sites require several Phase II ESAs in order to fully characterize contamination. Overall, the Phase II ESA is helpful to potential purchasers of contaminated property in that it provides background information necessary to develop a cleanup strategy, estimate costs, and address questions of liability that can affect the value of a property and its environs. Once environmental assessment is completed and contamination at a specific site characterized, a response action plan can be created to guide the technical steps of cleanup and redevelopment. The response action plan is important in obtaining liability assurance through programs offered by the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency and uses the findings of the Phase I and Phase II ESAs to propose a cleanup plan that fits the future use of the contaminated property. In summary, the environmental assessment process for a single property involves an initial assessment of former site history and operations, the Phase I Environmental Site Assessment, ESA. If potential contamination is identified, then a more thorough environmental investigation involving site-specific sampling is performed, the Phase II ESA. Once contamination is adequately characterized, then a response action plan can be created to address the contamination through cleanup. For more information on environmental site assessments, contact the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency here.